Tim continues, what is more, the old wine is preferable according to Luke. And you'll only find that feature in Luke chapter 5, verse 39, I believe, the very end of the parable, where it's Luke that reminds us that Yeshua says, no one after, I'm paraphrasing, no one after drinking new wine desires new wine, for he says to himself, the old is good or better, depending on which translation you're using, different Greek word that shows up. And the point I made is that if indeed the historic Christian allegorical interpretation of replacement, where Jesus is bringing something new, i.e. Christianity, and it's displacing the old, which is Judaism, if that's indeed accurate according to historic Christianity, then why would Jesus remind the readers in Luke, right, that the old is preferable, it's better, it's more desirable? If, according to the allegorical application that Christianity supplied, the old equates to Judaism or the law of Moses, right? Can you imagine Yeshua saying, no one after experiencing the new covenant desires the new covenant because he says to himself, the old covenant is better. Law of Moses is better. Judaism is better, right? That kind of flies in the face of the historic Christian example that they've been supplying for so many years, right? So we need to rethink this parable. According to Hegg, there's another way that I purposely have not been discussing on how to interpret this passage. So now we're ready to look at it. So Hegg says, rather, the contrast that we see in these passages relates to the ability of this skin to contain the wine. He continues, when connected to the whole enterprise of making disciples. Now pause, let me stop. Suddenly Tim's reminding us that there's this idea of making disciples. This is a detail that's notably absent from many Christian interpretations. Not all. So I'm not indicting everyone. I'm not throwing the entirety of Christianity under the bus. So don't think that's what I'm doing. What I'm saying is that we have a majority opinion and perspective, which is the replacement theology allegory. And then we have a kind of some minor interpretations that are floating around. And this is one of the minority opinions, along with the idea of the common sense factor. That's also a minority explanation. But listen to what Tim Tegg has to say about this. And I think there's some weight to it. And so just consider this. I'm not saying you have to upend your entire theology because of what I'm teaching right now. I do want to challenge you that if you're holding to a perspective that is akin to replacement theology or teaches that Judaism's out and Christianity's in, you probably want to abandon that sooner or later because it is entirely unbiblical. Again, there are aspects of replacement theology that are based in truth, but when we're talking about old man versus new man, the old man is definitely replaced by the new man. That aspect, when we talk about, if you're saying, well, God replaces the old man with the new man, and that's part of replacement theology, if that's what you're saying, well, then I have to agree with that theology. But by and large, the overall picture of replacement theology doesn't really focus on the old man, new man experience, right? The born again salvation experience. Most of the replacement theology discussions and conversations focus on we're no longer under the law. We Gentile Christians no longer have to keep the Torah anymore. That's the primary main point of discussion that at least I've encountered whenever I'm reading about replacement theology. The church has replaced Israel as the people of God. The new covenant has replaced the old covenant as the way in which to identify with God, etc., etc. That's the primary discussions that I have usually encountered. But let's continue. So Tim Hegg says, when connected to the whole enterprise of disciple making, so listen up, because this might be new to you. The contrast, when we're talking about making disciples, is between someone who has already become engulfed in the traditions of the elders as having absolute authority versus, or contrasting, someone who was essentially uneducated. So we're talking about going back to Jesus' day. We have Jesus going around and he's calling disciples unto himself. And if you remember, even from the casual reading of the Gospels, Yeshua didn't head straight to the academies of his day and select disciples from the learned, right? I mean, Paul is kind of a notable exception. Paul was one of those disciples of Yeshua that had a formal education, if we want to call it that, right? He was highly trained, sat at the feet of Gamaliel, or Gamliel, if you want to say the Hebrew pronunciation. But for the most part, if you're talking about the 12, the original 12, mostly what Yeshua was looking for was your very average, simple people to follow after him. And why? Why would he do that? Let's read Tim Hegg. Let's let Tim Hegg explain it in his way. Normally, Tim says, a sage like Yeshua would look for someone who had already excelled in his Torah studies to become one of his disciples. We kind of do that today. If you're going to apply to an Ivy League college, right, Yale, Harvard, or something like that, ideally the application preferably is going to show that you came from a school where you had very high grades, right? You kept a high grade point average. You did good in your studies. I mean, they're not just going to let anyone and everyone into their schools. So it's kind of the same principle going on. You want someone who's already got high marks in their education.